the project started coincidentally with a wave of xenophobia. And I believe that that year there was a man from Zimbabwe who was killed in a township in Johannesburg. And for me, that's one image I cannot take out of my mind. The image of Ernesto, the Mozambican man who was burnt alive.
I know for our lay audience, they may not get it that in a university where we have academics who are seen as the great thinkers of the world, how would they suffer marginalization?
It's a form of silencing. For a lot of us, that's xenophobia. It's this violent, grotesque action against foreigners that happens somewhere in the townships. That happens in a place that is removed from the civility of, of a place like a university campus.
What inspired you to take on this study? Was there a particular moment or story that made you say, this needs to be researched?
Yeah, so as you know, our book came out of a 2-year research process. And what sparked it, I believe it was around about 2020, 2021. There was a surge in xenophobic attacks in South Africa. And by now they've become almost episodic. They come at these regular intervals, and it seems that the intervals are becoming shorter and shorter in between. But shortly after that, my colleagues, Professor Jonathan Janssen and Dr. Cyril Walters, came together and we were talking about what this means. And unbeknownst to me, they had already been in conversation with each other on the absurdity of these xenophobic attacks, but also because they are also higher education theorists. They're already starting to question how far these have gone into the university, or if at all. So I joined an ongoing conversation of my two colleagues, and them being South African, because the two of them are South African, and I, as a Zimbabwean, I found it quite profound that these were South African scholars who were questioning these very acts. And so then started I would say, a very rigorous 2-year process, wanting to know how does this play out in the university, and what does it look like for academics from other African countries.
Oh, then in the course of your research, what was one story or testimony from an academic that really stuck with you and why?
I think there's several. So if you read our book, what you will find is what we did, because our studies across 26 universities, public universities, what you would call state universities, and we encountered many, many academics. But as we went along, we realized that first and foremost, very early into the studies, into the research, we had to hire a psychologist as a support for the project because of just the emotional labor that came from just talking about these issues. Not for us, but for the participants as well. We would debrief sometimes in tears. And we realized that even our participants needed that support. So that just goes to show you that the issues that were discussed in this book were deeply intimate and deeply touching for the scholars. Number two, we realized we were going to do a normal book where we collect data. We took 6 stories out of the many scholars that we interviewed. We took 6 stories and we made them case studies. And we used a process called re-narration. I think a lot of scholars who have done a narrative inquiry would understand. We analyzed the stories almost wholesale, and we told it almost like so that a reader can feel as if they're having a conversation with that participant. And those stories are available in our book. So out of those six, I think all six of them are quite striking. Some of the scholars that we used as case studies, they chose to be named in our book because that is how strongly they feel about this matter and committed to the social justice element of around xenophobia. So one such scholar is the renowned philosopher and social theorist Professor Ashio Mbembe. He is originally from Cameroon, but has, especially if you are in academia, he has now become a household name. It's difficult to do social theory and you have not engaged with him. And when we interviewed him, what struck us about his story is, for example, the fact that even at this level, he has been in South Africa for over 20 years. And even at that level, he still struggles with visa issues. Something as archaic as visa issues. You would think by now, surely, this is someone who gives annual lectures at the leading universities around the world. But also what struck us about his narrative is his commitment to Africa. It's not just South Africa. So this is something that a lot of people, I think lay people who are not in the university, when they hear about African scholars in South African universities, some people think it's about jobs, that foreigners are coming to steal our jobs. But we didn't get that sense, especially when you read the narrative from Professor Mbembe, who he can just as easily go to any country, any university, and they would welcome him with both open hands. But yet he chooses to be on the continent, to be in South Africa. It is a form of oppositional consciousness on his part. And we felt it was almost activist on his part. Although he played it down and said his wife and his children, they're all South African. But it was things like that. That really struck us. I mean, I could go all day just telling you narrative after narrative after narrative. There's also another academic, but they refused to be named, so we gave them a pseudonym. They are from a North African country. If you talk to people every day, they will tell you that people from North Africa don't consider themselves African. But this academic, that wasn't the case. He told us of the day Nelson Mandela was released from prison and how there was celebration in his city for Nelson Mandela's release. And he felt such a deep connection with South Africa. And for him, being in South Africa is a way of contributing to the continent, because in his own country, they had fled war. And so being in South Africa was a way of staying in touch with that part of his home where he was actually chased away from as a young boy, and still being in solidarity with the continent. And this was a very common theme among a lot of the academics that we talked to, a deep sense of commitment to not just South Africa, but the African project through their work.
I know for our lay audience, they may not get it that in a university where we have academics who are seen as the great thinkers of the world, how would they suffer marginalization? And I just wanted to paint a picture of what marginalization looks like in a university setting, from whether hiring to promotion, and also whose knowledge is considered valuable. Can you just paint a picture for us to understand?
Yeah, certainly I can. So when we started the project, Ismail, like I told you, the project started coincidentally with a wave of xenophobia. And I believe that that year there was a man from Zimbabwe who was killed in a township in Johannesburg. Now, for people, when you talk about xenophobia, that is what comes to mind. The image, and for me, that's one image I cannot take out of my mind. The image of Ernesto, the Mozambican man who was burnt alive in Durban in 2015, I believe. For a lot of us, that's xenophobia. It's this violent, grotesque action against foreigners that happens somewhere in the townships. That happens in a place that is removed from the civility of, of a place like a university campus. And so that's why it was important for us to give it a name, academic xenophobia, because this xenophobia, it's a form of silencing, like you say. It is a form of making invisible. So the contributions of African scholars are not well acknowledged, and the experiences are multi-layered. Some reported to us being held back where they should promotions, short-term contracts. So where they should have been full-time, they continue to be postdoctoral fellows, and there is no tenure in sight. There is one particular scholar, she is at UCT. She said the discrimination is so subtle that you even start to question your own sanity, that is this what is exactly happening? And then, but she said that what she has learned over time is not to ruffle any feathers, to take on extra working load. So when everybody else is going home, it's the weekend, they're relaxing, you find the foreign academics, they're working overtime. They are teaching extra classes. They are working out of their minds to publish more, to contribute, so that they don't feel like a burden. It's almost like being a child that has been adopted into a family but never accepted. And so you're made to feel that you need to work for the grace of being in this household. You need to prove that you are thankful. And so it was these subtle prejudices. But we also found some which were quite overwhelming. For example, where university processes intersect with visa processes. A lot of scholars talked about being isolated from their families. They come to South Africa, but they cannot get a visa for their wives. One academic, it was so sad, and they had come to South Africa, and then it took a few years from Nigeria. It took a few years for their wife to get a visa, a spousal visa. And it took a few more years for their son to get a visa. But while all of this was happening, they had a child here in South Africa. But because they were in the middle of processing their documents, they couldn't get a birth certificate for the newborn child. And it had been, I believe, 13 months, and they wanted to go to Nigeria with the newborn baby, but they could not because there were no documents. So they were stuck. And the trauma of that, for some people, it might be like, man, that doesn't feel like anything. But imagine being trapped in a space where you feel like you doomed if you go, doomed if you don't. There is no way of moving forward or moving back. And those were quite a lot of the stories that we encountered.
Yeah, were there differences between how African academics experience marginalization in South Africa and then in other parts of the world? Are there any specific examples?
Well, our study was squarely focused on South Africa. Like I said, we studied 26, all the 26 public universities in South Africa. But I would like to believe that there are parallels with what is happening elsewhere. I mean, this idea of being a foreigner being seen as a troubled entity is not unique to South Africa. Everywhere in the world, there are issues of inhospitality. And in my own home country, I believe that we grew up hearing names that are given to people who come from other places, from other lands, other countries. So it's not new. However, what is striking for us is how it has permeated a space like a university. Because the university is it's an ideal. A university is an ideal society. It's like a city on a hill. We're trying to reimagine what society can be. Some people talk about university being an ivory tower. It should be, because this is where we reimagine society and think differently about the possibilities of what our society can be. And so if such a thing as xenophobia penetrates to the university, then doomed is a greater society, because this is where we're supposed to propagate good ideas, good citizens. So to come back to your point, yes, I believe this is a more widespread issue, but then more specific research would need to be done in localized settings to see how the concept then plays out. In South Africa, we said that the problem of the foreign African scholar emerges from the nexus of policy, national policy, as in what is happening with the Home Affairs, institutional sentiments, and these interpersonal connections. So it's within this triangle that academic xenophobia plays out in South Africa. But if the concept was to be taken, say, to Ghana, somebody would need to interrogate, how does it play out in Ghana? What facilitates xenophobia or this sense of othering or discrimination of foreign academics in Ghanaian universities? And I highly suspect that certain unique trends will emerge there, but someone else will need to take up that study.
Definitely. Were there any stories of resistance or resilience, how someone found ways to thrive despite these barriers?
There were a lot. There were a lot. So across the 26 public institutions, we found that even within one university, it's not a single story. It's not that the university does not like foreign academics. No. We saw that they are what we call enclaves of care. For example, one academic who was at UCT talked about how the compassion of their head of department, for example, and how they ran around and tried to help them when they were having visa issues. Another academic at Stellenbosch University talked about how their colleagues even offered them a place to stay, because once you start having visa issues, you cannot secure accommodation, you cannot secure bank cards, for example, because these systems are interconnected. Once you don't have a formal documentation, or it is in limbo for whatever reason, not that you are an illegal resident, peradventure your documentation is in limbo, you can't get a bank card, you can't access your money, you can't get secure place to stay. And this academic told us how it was their colleagues who accommodated them for months. So there are these stories of kindness, of care. And another academic also, and her story is in there, and she accepted to be named. Her name is Professor Chisaza. She's a professor of economics at University of Pretoria. She talked about how she feels so deeply indebted to her department because of the level of support that they have given her throughout her career. So it's not a story of doom and gloom. That, oh, South Africans are mean. I think that is the wrong narrative. What we're trying to show here is that there are circumstances beyond personal politics that can make it incredibly difficult for African scholars to thrive in South African institutions. But in spite of these circumstances, there are pockets that show us that it's possible to do things differently. And even in terms of resistance, quite a lot of the academics told us that for them, even toning themselves down is an act of self-preservation. If you don't mind, I can find the page and read you a line from one academic, and she's talking about this strategy of almost not dumbing herself down, but just cooling off who they are, just so that they don't ruffle any feathers. So this is a narrative by Dr. Munya Kabwe. She's based at University of Cape Town. Quite an extraordinary academic in the field of theatre and drama. And she says, it is hard to discern subtle prejudices, but one learns strategies to read and navigate these complexities as a Black migrant. My previous experiences in the academy or in the university have taught me a few lessons. One key approach involves maintaining a calm demeanor and being agreeable to avoid confrontation, essentially for self-preservation. This tactic, although strategic, stems from a desire not to stir up trouble or attract undue attention in potentially sensitive situations. So here is a brilliant scholar in a university setting where the idea of the university is it's a theater of ideas. This is where ideas contest and come and have conversation with each other. This is the place for debate. And yet this scholar is saying, sometimes I draw back, I remove myself, because if I am seen to be too vocal, too out there, it might ruffle some people. Start to ask, who does she think she is, or something like that. So these are some of the narratives that we saw, and hers is similar to many others.
Yeah, so some of these narratives you've mentioned, I see a lot of reactions from some colleagues in the universities who are helping each other. But can you pinpoint some universities that you could say they wholly stand out for doing things differently? Is it possible, or all of them have the same situation, the same issue?
I think I can't say that this one university has it right, because we are all in South Africa and all contending with this climate. Because the other thing that we wanted to point the reader to is that this xenophobia is coming from, it's a fear that is seeping in from outside the university and influencing how a university operates. Okay. So it's almost like a cancer that is eating away at institutions. What was something that we thought was happening in the streets is getting into the core of an institution such as the university. Now, there are some universities that are doing far better than most. There are some universities that are more challenging, but it's not because the university itself is intentionally malicious. For example, urban universities like the University of Cape Town, University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg are more in the public eye because, number one, they're urban, they're bigger, and they're historically white. And that's also an important marker. And so what happens there seems to be constantly in the spotlight, whereas universities that are more rural, because it is very hard for them to attract talent anyway. For example, to get young academics who are willing to uproot their lives and go and live in a rural town where there is a university. So they tend to then draw from a far wider pool of African academics, unlike bigger universities. So it's an uneven terrain.
Okay, and if you could speak directly to university leaders right now, what's one change you would ask them to make today?
I'm an academic. One is not enough. What I would say is there is need to have leaders who are sensitive to the situations of their academics. So at the level of heads of departments, heads of faculty, to understand these processes because they have a profound effect on how people work and how they execute their scholarship. And the need for these key players to be sensitive to these matters. Number two, I think it is the university rethinking its role, not just as South African universities, but as African universities, and what that would do for their place, not only in history, but their place within the global geopolitics of knowledge. I think it is too limited for universities as big as some of the universities we have in South Africa to think of themselves as South African universities. I think there is an opportunity and there is a Pan-African impetus for them to think of themselves as African universities. And if you actually go onto the websites of some of the bigger universities, like the University of the Fort Hare, they, in their branding, in their narratives, in their rhetoric, they refer to themselves as African universities. And yet Africans do not feel welcome in their halls. So there is a disconnect somewhere that needs to be addressed. Professor Mbembe, who I mentioned earlier, in the book says South Africa needs to contend with the surname of its name. It needs to think about its place within the African continent. And I think that speaks more, not just to what is happening within the university, but even beyond.
Yes. This clearly connects to the bigger conversations about decolonizing education. How do you see your findings fitting into that movement?
How do I see our findings?
Yes.
We didn't connect directly with decolonization per se, but our finding was which was something that surprised us. When Fees Must Fall happened in 2015 to 2017, and South African students were demanding that universities decolonize, it was African scholars that came in. If you remember, I don't know if you remember this image of, I believe it's University of Cape Town, where students were having these mass lectures as a counterpoint to this is how we want to learn. We want to learn, we want to have knowledge from the continent. Do you know who brought that knowledge? It was scholars from outside of South Africa, because they had an experience of decolonization that had not squarely been experienced here within South Africa. They came with frameworks for that conversation. Now, not saying exclusive of scholars from other African countries, but there was a reliance on if we are to decolonize, what pathways shall we go to? Because remember, the pathway that South Africa, even into leading to its democratic era, is unique from other African countries that had to contend with the very notion of decolonization. So there was this need now for having these voices from elsewhere to come and say, okay, we realize that we need to decolonize our universities. How do we do it? Where do we start? And I think in reverse, a second thing that we found was what is attracting African scholars to South Africa. South Africa has, unlike many African countries, managed to build up a very stable tertiary sector.
Finally, what's the next step for you? Are there more stories you want to tell, more work you want to do on this issue?
Certainly. I think this work actually was, not I think, I know that this work was a little left field from my core work. Actually, my core work is I am an Ubuntu scholar. I work on Ubuntu as a philosophy of education, which touches on also decolonization, and I also do some feminist theory. So obviously this has garnered a lot of attention. We are going to be presenting a panel. I'm going to be in Durban next week on a panel for Durban University of Technology's Internationalization Week. And we're getting a lot of requests to speak to universities on this matter. And in September, we're going to be presenting at a conference at Sussex University for the British Education Research Association conference. So yes, the work is going to continue. But in terms of my own research, it's most likely that I'm going to move to stories around Ubuntu, because I think that's also something that I'm passionate about, telling those stories, which is bringing our indigenous knowledge into universities and codifying our knowledge into curricula. So yeah, I think that's what the future holds for me.
That's great work. Thank you very much, Dr. Precious Simba, for speaking with us on the Global South Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.